So welcome to today's presentation. So today we are gonna have a small presentation on whether SDGs are good, whether SDGs are bad, and how effective SDGs have been. So we are gonna analyze and evaluate sustainable development goals. Um, so what do you like? The thing that you look here was drafted in 2000, just 2000 by United Nations. So it's called Millennial Development Goals. So the all 8 goals are somewhat intertwined with poverty. So the sole focus was on poverty. So this was like the first time that United Nations and countries came together to come up with something towards development, and environmental sustainability was a small part of it, and it was very vague. No, it was basically drafted from a top to down approach. So it was only big officials who basically came up with these goals, and then in 2000 and then in 2015, in 2012, United Nations gathered in Brazil, and they basically thought, oh yeah, MDGs are not working anymore, we need even more specific goals. So this time they came up with sustainable development goals, and sustainable development goals are much better because reason number one, they were more specific. So there are nearly 169 targets in SDGs. So the 17 targets are like the overview, and under each target you have so for example, in poverty we have, oh yeah, we have to eradicate extreme poverty. So extreme poverty is basically the income is below $1.95. So it was more specific, and there were like 169 targets, and there were over 200 measuring parameters as well. So it was way more specific. And this time, basically, United Nations involved all member states, private actors, and they all collaborated together with to come up with all these. And now the major advantage of sustainable development goals is that it's highly data driven. So the data are collected from various aspects from every country. Like all the member states are like data, and we'll further we'll look into how good the measuring of data is. But it was much better, and there are reports periodically on how well the country is progressing, which country is doing good, which country is doing bad, what they can do in order to do better. So all in all, SDGs, when compared to MDGs, SDGs are much better. And SDGs is data driven. There are a lot of funds to implement SDGs. And it was SDGs was basically based on cooperation and collaboration between different actors. Now we look into what these SDGs are. So this is a small video from United Nations, which basically, yeah. So as we just got introduced to the 17 goals, so basically each of the MDGs are being elaborated into more specific. So SDGs are more specific form of MDGs, and their goal is sustainability. And as we know, the definition of sustainability is basically ensuring that we are developing without compromising that the future generation don't run out of resources.
So in Shakti had already mentioned what the SDGs, like the pros were, but if you were to put it in a more structured form, it was justifiable to set the SDGs without guidance on how to achieve them, because they were intended to raise consciousness about development issues. Now, an example of this is the USA's Inflation Reduction Act, which was established this year itself as like the climate action movement, and there was more growing pressure to do for climate justice grew. The USA decided to enact this bill, which had, among many other things, was the biggest investment in climate action and resources. So Biden had come into office campaigning on climate justice before the US was the leading contributor to greenhouse gases. They had failed to ratify the Kyoto Protocol and had previously withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. Now, with this bill, there would be more investment going towards reducing greenhouse gases by 50%. The IRA uses tax credits to incentivize consumers to buy electric cars, electric HVAC systems, and other forms of cleaner technology, leading to less emissions from cars and electricity generation. And it also includes incentive for companies to manufacture the technology in the United States. It also includes money for a host of other climate priorities, like investing in forest and coastal restoration and resilient agriculture. Now, besides all of that, there was also tax breaks. They were offering incentives, and overall, $60 billion went to environmental justice, and around 15 billion had gone to clean energy opportunities and low income disadvantaged communities. So now that the SDGs were established, they had given liberty to the countries themselves to see as they saw fit to how they would achieve these goals. It gave them more freedom. If they had enacted a particular methodology that had to be covered and they did not cover it, then there would be like much more bureaucracy involved. So with them giving just more of an aspirational goal, it gave more liberty to the countries. Now this is where the theory of like realism comes in, where each country's sovereignty. So each country has the power to do whatever they want to do within their own borders. And since they always act in their own national interest, the SDGs just do not conflict with that idea itself. And it did, all in all, help, as we can see, to hopefully make the climate action movement much more effective.
The next thing I want to say about SDGs is that because they're 17 and that they're so holistic, that one thing they really help with is the classification of different global issues into categories, which really helps in specialization in different problem-solving methods by state governments. Now, one thing you will see in the case study that I'm going to tell you guys about is that it really is very much up to state governments and state actors about how much effort they want to put into solving SDGs. So there are a lot of different problems there. Like if there's political instability, for example, a state government may not be able to focus on SDGs. But when there is successful collaboration between NGOs, IGOs, and the UN and state governments, it is very much possible to have successful specialization of issues. And one good thing about the SDGs is that there's a lot of emphasis on solving inequality. So I'm going to show you. This is an example of an organization. It's called Fit for School. It's a case study from the South Asia Pacific region, specifically in the countries Indonesia, Cambodia, Laos, and Philippines. Now, this initiative was part of guidance from that the UN put out in the SDGs, specifically for guidelines under SDGs 6 and 4. This organization based this initiative on these SDGs. And they collaborated with the governments of these 4 countries in local and regional schools to give different schools access to water, hygiene, and sanitation. These are called WASH initiatives. And schools in these 4 countries with a lack of WASH initiatives had a lot of prevalence of preventable diseases like diarrhea or different things that would affect the level of learning in these schools. So there was a case study that was done by UNICEF before and after these WASH initiatives were implemented. And they found that the level of learning and efficiency in these schools went up a lot. The level of these diseases went down a lot. And you can see that with good planning and collaboration with state actors and organizations, it's possible to reduce inequality. Now, unfortunately, I did say that there is a focus on inequality, yes, but there is a massive problem with how SDGs are measured. Now, the SDGs are measured with something called the SDG index, which a lot of global policy makers refer to. So now, because of this, SDGs, you'll find that they're nearly insignificant in terms of ecological sustainability. they're very much biased towards rich Western countries. Like you'll see that countries that top the SDG index are often some of the most environmentally unsustainable countries. So let me explain how the weightage works, how countries are evaluated, because this is very important to understand why it's unfair. So there are 17 SDGs. Now, each SDG has specific indicators that are made specific to the SDG on how to measure it. And these indicators can come in 3 categories. The first one is ecological impact. Next is social development, which includes like poverty, for example. And the next is infrastructure development, which is just very much related to economic development. Now, they do contain, every SDG has at least 3 of like these indicators. Now, each one has a different number of indicators. The problem here is that the indicators are mostly based on infrastructure development rather than ecological sustainability or social development. So I'll give you an example. SDG 11, which talks about sustainable infrastructure. You would think that you want to focus more on ecological sustainability here. Now, this SDG has 4 indicators that are used to measure it, and 3 out of 4 of them are measuring economic and infrastructure development, and only 1 of them talks about ecological sustainability. So you'll see that like countries like Sweden and Norway, they overcompensate in the development indicators rather than the ecological indicators, making them appear higher, like in this SDG, making them appear to have higher scores than how much they're actually sustainable. Let's take Sweden, for example. Okay, it scores an 84.7 on the SDG index, which is amazing. It's shocking. It's the top country on the index. But it consumes an excessive amount of natural resources. Now, the world average world average consumption per year of natural resources is 12 tons of carbon, I think. And the sustainable level is 7. And Sweden's level is 32, which is almost 5 times the sustainable amount, which is absolutely ridiculous. And if the world were to be consuming as much as Sweden was consuming, it would be like using all of the resources that we're currently using, all of the environmental problems that we have right now, but times 3. So we'd be doomed. Additionally, only 4 of the SDGs focus on ecological sustainability, which is not sustainable. Yes. That's it. Okay.
Now as we saw a lot of problems with measurements and how countries are being unsustainable, so what is the root cause of these problems, right? Like, what is causing countries to not achieve sustainable development goals? So basically, there are claims that countries are not able to attain SDGs because of the system. And if we have to achieve the SDGs, then firstly we have to change how the system works. And now I will show you 2 quotes. So first one says, the economy should no longer be oriented solely towards private profit, which if you connect it to SDG, by following sustainable development goals, it's less likely that a country or let's say a private firm will be able to gain private profit, because the incentive is profit, and like it just works towards profit. So like there is no SDG in the play. And secondly, so the approach that SDG takes is wrong. I mean, this is just one aspect, this is just one argument, that breaking the power system was never the aim of SDG. So like the as Amani talked in from a realist perspective, there's a huge power dynamics that kind of rules how the SDGs and the execution works. And now if you do not break these power dynamics, then we won't be able to attain these goals, because at the end of the day, these SDGs are just goals. They're not execution plans. And if you want to achieve these SDGs, there should be executive plan, and these executive plans should focus more on breaking these power dynamics. Okay, so now getting more specific into these, like what is the mistake with the problem? Sorry, what is the problem with the system? So, firstly, no country is obliged to achieve SDGs. So, as Amani talked before, countries care more about their national interest. Therefore, they like each country has its own sovereignty, despite even though they participate in these SD Sustainable Development Goals. One of the examples might be how China's prime minister did not attend the COP26 because they're not obliged to attend or uh, do like take part in the Sustainable Development Goals. And there's a lot of bureaucracy, as I just talked about. There are lots of parameters, there are lots of measurements, and the targets get too specific. When it gets too specific, it has, even though it might help us measure and like make a good track, but it has a lot of disadvantages as well, so which I will elaborate in a upcoming case study. And secondly, developed countries often offshore their ecological impact. And also this again relates back to climate justice. A good case study for this would be how uh, Denmark imports palm oil from Indonesia. So that way they are not actually they are being unsustainable. But if you look at the SDGs parameter, it does not measure them taking palm oil from Indonesia. It only measures what happens within the border. But as you know, the world is more transborder. It's globalized. Resources move from different countries, and as Anya just talked about, like a lot of consumers, like for example, United States economy is highly consumerist, but the resources don't come from themselves. It comes from other countries. It's fuel from resources from other countries. And secondly, when so for example, because of the carbon emissions, there have been a lot of natural disasters, especially in developing countries. So since so scientifically, when global warming happens, it's usually global south which gets affected the more, because uh, the equatorial zone has higher impact than the non-equatorial zone, which means the global south is getting affected more, even though even though their consumerism is less, even though their resource consumption is less, still they are facing the consequences. And this is basically what we call climate injustice. And now this is one of the case studies. So one of the world's largest ecosystem is dying. So this ecosystem is called Balkesh Alakol Basin, and it's like more than it's like so huge. It's more than uh, GB, Holland, Denmark, Switzerland, and Belgium, like all together. So, and it has lots of natural resources. It has a huge lake, and they have like a very high ecological environment. Uh, However, as we know, a lot of countries focus on economic development. So, economic development, as in countries aim for going to higher GDP. And if you look at economics, so basically there is a thing where most developed countries have higher tertiary sector production than primary sector production. So, which kind of pushes developing countries to also look forward to like increasing their tertiary production and not focus on primary production, because at the end of the day, we value economic development, and all the government policies in most of the government is centered around GDP and like increasing the gross domestic products via exports, via consumerism, materialism, and stuff. So since there was high economic growth, so they started building big reservoirs. There was increase in budgetary expenditure. So it's basically how macroeconomic objectives work. So the country basically started increasing their taxes, then spending those money on developmental projects. However, they completely ignored the fact of sustainable development. But still, they were since if you would have seen the SDGs, economic and infrastructure is also a part of SDGs. So even so, basically, the country was performing way more in ecological development because of the lot of resources that they have. But in terms of economic development, they were not progressing much, because they are mostly based on primary sector. So basically what the country did, so they started focusing more on economic development than environmental development. And what this led to is basically they're trying to like equalize both sustainable development and economic development. But this is a very sensitive ecological region, and that like they should be like preserving their natural resources and not exploiting them, or not like export. They should not be exporting their natural resources to other countries, because by exporting it kind of like demolishes the entire food chain and the ecology. And now this is when the not one size fits all come into play. So the entire SDGs does not fit for every country, because in case of this basin, they should be focusing more on environmental sustainability and not on economical development, because this country is not made like this basin is not for building dams, they're for preserving the natural ecosystem. But however based on European Union suggestions, they came up with something called law on Lake Balkesh, which is like it turned out to be positive. So in this case, they basically involve a lot of stakes. So this is one of the unique approaches where they basically involve all stakeholders. So just like how a public company works, so they basically sold their stake, or like the stocks of this ecosystem, to people, businesses, and the government. So basically everyone has a stake into governing how this thing works. So it was basically made public, and it was a social corporation now. So now, since it is in the hands of multiple stakeholders, so it's so since businesses work, even though businesses want higher profit, that doesn't mean they can exploit it, because they can't take sole decision over how the resources are allocated. So yeah.
As Shakti and Anya mentioned, there are like many different factors. I'd be going into like what those factors are and what they mean. So there, as we mentioned, there can be collaboration between state and non-state actors. But one of the things that can be affecting is political instability. There can also be all of these are basically based on the policies that are passed. Now, strengthening the policy environment for peace building has often required efforts to address key conflict issues such as natural resource extraction, equitable distribution of resources, injustice, and marginalization of disadvantaged sectors. At the national level, if it is not accompanied with proper reform, then it will fail. The UNDP also has also not leveraged their proximity with the government to push the agenda of local governance, particularly with line ministries other than the one dealing with local governance. For instance, a formal consideration of energy has been largely missing from the decentralization and sector-specific policies of several least developed and sub-Saharan African countries in which the UNDP has worked. The UNDP has also not capitalized on the potential linkages it could have built with other UN agencies to promote decentralization and local governance within the different land ministries. Besides this, UNDP supported local governance initiatives being regarded as innovative and scaled up, as in Cambodia, Mozambique, and Nepal were not really the case. There were boutique